Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, everyone. We like to unpack this whole idea of creativity and mental illness, right?
Yeah, kind of like where does one begin in the other end?
Exactly. So much gray area there. And this week, we're going deep with, well, no surprise, Emily Dickinson. I mean, the poetry alone, so intense, so much going on under the
Oh,
surface.
for sure. And right from the start, you hit this intriguing thing with Dickinson. She's got nearly 1,800 poems left behind, and a lot of them never even shared while she was alive.
That's crazy. Like, what was she thinking? What's the story there?
Right. It makes you wonder about her intentions, like what drove her creative process? Was it for herself, or did she want an audience eventually?
So for folks who aren't super familiar with Dickinson's life, what's the deal? Where'd she come from?
Well, she's born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. Seemingly normal upbringing in a lot of ways. But then there are these things that, jump out at you when you think about all the stuff that's in her poetry.
Okay, so what should we be keeping an eye out for? Like, what in her childhood matters here?
Well, her father, Edward, he was a big deal in town, super prominent, but also known for being pretty strict.
Uh-oh. I can see where this is going.
Yeah, lots of people think his personality had a huge impact on how Emily saw the world. You see her wrestling with ideas of authority and rebellion in her writing. Classic stuff,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. That father-daughter dynamic, always
Yeah.
a good source for literature.
No kidding. And then her mom, Emily, too, she had these really bad bouts of depression,
Oh, wow.
especially after Emily's younger sister, Lavinia, was born. Now, saying someone from way back when had a diagnosis is tough.
Yeah, you can't really know for sure.
Right. But knowing this family stuff makes it more complicated when you try to understand Emily's own, well, emotional world.
For sure. You got to think about how that household was,
Mm-hmm.
and how it shaped her and her writing. And speaking of which, we can't not talk about Emily Dickinson being, well, kind of recluse. She basically stayed home all the time, right?
That's the image, for sure. And there's definitely truth to it. Rarely left her home, like you said. Preferred letters and, of course, poetry to actually talking to people. Some folks think maybe it was agoraphobia or social anxiety.
Yeah, makes sense.
But others see it as like a deliberate choice, creating her own space for art without society getting in the way.
I could see it both ways, honestly.
Mm.
Avoiding people because of anxiety, yeah. But also, being alone gives you freedom, right? You can focus on what's important to you.
Exactly. It's that struggle, wanting connection but needing isolation. That's what makes Dickinson's life so interesting to dig into. And it's not just in how she lived, but also in her relationships, which, from the letters, were intense, some even messy.
Wait, so she wasn't totally isolated. Tell me about those relationships.
Well, her letters to her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert Dickinson, those are super revealing. They're close, really emotionally connected, but there's also hints of, jealousy, possessiveness even.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Well, Susan was married to Emily's brother, Austin.
Oof. Talk about tangled family drama.
Yeah, no kidding. So you've got all this stuff happening in her personal life, plus her choice to, withdraw from the world. It really makes you wonder what was going on in her head. And that, of course, takes us to the big question, mental illness.
Yeah, the elephant in the room. Was Emily Dickinson just eccentric, or was there something, more serious going on?
It's impossible to say for sure. But a lot in her writing points to, well, a mind dealing with a ton of emotion, maybe some mental illness too. For example, that famous poem, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. People often think it's her describing a mental breakdown.
That's the one where the mourners are walking around inside her head, right? So creepy, like being trapped inside your own thoughts.
Exactly. And there are lines in there, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then.
Chilling stuff. Sounds like losing consciousness, falling into some unknown place.
Whoa, powerful stuff. But even if we don't get into specific diagnoses, her poetry is so intense emotionally. Do you think all this, her life, maybe mental health struggles, is that what fueled her creativity? That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's exactly what we'll be unpacking throughout this whole deep dive.
Yeah, it's easy to draw a line from her struggles to her art, but that might be too simple. Are there other ways to understand her work?
Definitely. Some scholars say her poetry is mostly inspired by, the writing styles that were popular then, or by how people thought about love and death back then. They see her weird style, the dashes and slant rhyme, as artistic choices, not a sign of a troubled mind.
So maybe we're reading too much into her personal life when we look at her poems.
It's a tough balance, right? We want to get the artist, but we can't just reduce their work to a biography.
True. True. And I think that's what's so cool about the Mad Genius Thesis. We're not looking for easy answers. It's all about exploring the human mind, how all that complexity turns into creative expression.
And with Emily Dickinson, oh man, we've got a complex case study. Her life, her poems, maybe mental illness, it all gives us this peek into the creative process, how what's happening inside us can shape what we make.
Totally. And in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to be looking at some of those connections more closely. We'll break down some other poems, the themes, the imagery. Think about how her unique point of view came from her experiences and maybe her mental health.
And we'll also look at the world she lived in, the social stuff, the expectations, see how those might have shaped her choices and her writing.
This is going to be a wild ride, folks, so stick with us.
So we were talking about I felt a funeral in my brain. I mean, it's hard to shake that poem off, you know?
Yeah, it really gets under your skin. The mourners, the planks breaking in her reason. Like, was she using metaphors, or was that really what it felt like inside her head?
Right. That's what keeps people debating, right?
Hmm.
Personal experience or artistic exploration. We might never know for sure, but we can look for other clues in her poetry, see if there are themes or patterns that tell us more about her inner world.
Okay, so what else jumps out at you in her work?
Well, isolation and confinement are everywhere. You know, even poems that aren't about a breakdown, there's this feeling of being trapped. Like she's on the outside looking in, like, it was not death, for I stood up.
Oh, yeah. That one is so vivid, it's almost like she's hallucinating. Do you think those lines could be describing a dissociative state? Like she's disconnected from reality?
It's possible, for sure. The way she describes her senses, Sirocco's crawl, but her marble feet are cold. It's a really physical, almost unreal experience, like being stuck between two worlds, not belonging anywhere.
And that feeling of not belonging, of being different, it all kind of goes back to her being so reclusive, right? Like she built a wall between herself and everyone else, which maybe reflects some kind of emotional or psychological wall she had inside.
That's a great connection. And it makes you think about how social norms back then affected her. Women were supposed to be quiet, follow the rules, you know. So her withdrawing from society, expressing herself through writing, maybe that was her rebellion.
Wow, so her reclusiveness, which could be a sign of mental illness, could also be her fighting back, claiming her own space and voice when the world was trying to silence her.
Exactly. It adds a whole new layer, right? Her poetry wasn't just about her struggles, it was how she found strength, empowerment. Writing let her create a world where she could be herself without anyone judging her.
That's powerful. Like creativity is a lifeline, a
Yeah.
way to deal with pain and find meaning when everything is too much.
Totally. And it resonates with so many artists who struggle with mental health, right? Creating becomes therapy, a way to process emotions and make sense of the world.
We should be careful though, right? We
Right.
don't want to romanticize mental illness. It's not like you need to suffer to make great art.
Oh, definitely not. But we do need to acknowledge how our weaknesses, our unique experiences, shape what we create. And with Dickinson, it's obvious that her life, her struggles, her sensitivity, it all went into making these poems that are both deeply personal and speak to everyone.
So how do we put those two sides together? The amazing poet who wrote these incredible lines and the woman who is so isolated may be dealing with anxieties we can only guess at.
That's the big question, isn't it? And we may never have a perfect answer. Maybe that's part of what makes Emily Dickinson so fascinating. She's an enigma. She forces us to confront how complex the mind is and how those vulnerabilities can be sources of both pain and beauty.
That's beautifully put. And it makes me think about our whole show, the Mad Genius Thesis. We focus on the connection between creativity and mental illness, but maybe it's not about a direct link, but rather seeing all the ways our experiences, good and bad, shape our artistic vision.
Exactly. It's about appreciating how complex humans are and recognizing that creativity can blossom anywhere, even in darkness and despair.
And that's an important message, right? Especially with all the stigma around mental illness, talking about artists like Emily Dickinson helps destigmatize it. It encourages empathy and understanding.
Totally. And it shows people they can embrace their vulnerabilities, see their experiences as strengths, as fuel for creativity.
So where do we go from here? We've explored Dickinson's life, looked closely at her poetry, considered the possibility of mental illness, and thought about how her struggles and her genius are connected. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, it's important to remember this is just the beginning. Our deep dive today, it's a spark, you know, to make you curious, to get you thinking about creativity and mental illness, and to look at Dickinson's work in a new way.
Exactly. Keep exploring on your own. Read her poems, her letters, learn about her time period, come to your own conclusions.
And tell us what you think. Share your thoughts, your favorite Dickinson poems, anything you've realized about creativity and mental illness. Hit us up on social media.
Because this conversation never ends. It needs nuance, empathy, and a willingness to deal with tough questions.
And by sharing our perspectives, listening to each other, we can build a world where mental illness isn't shameful, but part of the human experience.
And with that, we're going to wrap up our deep dives into Emily Dickinson. Thanks for coming along with us.
You know, as we wrap up with Emily Dickinson, I find myself thinking about her work. Like, even after a century and a half, it still makes you think, about what it means to create, to be an artist, to really wrestle with the world in this way that's so personal, but somehow we all connect to it.
I know what you mean. We've talked about her being a recluse, the mental illness question, her strange style. But it's that tension, that back and forth between wanting to be part of the world but also needing to pull away. That's what I keep thinking about.
It's almost like both of those things, the wanting connection and needing solitude, they both had to be there for her to make art.
Maybe that's why her poetry still hits us so hard. It speaks to that human thing. We want to belong, but we got to be ourselves, even if it means being different.
That's a really good point. It makes you think about what artists are supposed to do, right? Are they mirrors showing us the world? Or are they supposed to challenge us, make us see things differently?
Dickinson, it seems like she did both. She showed us the anxieties of her time, but she also gave us this unique vision, a way to see things that was beautiful, but also kind of disturbing.
It's like she built her own world in her poems, a world with its own rules, its own language, its own way of dealing with time and space. And when she lets us in, we have to rethink what's possible, not just in art, but in life, too.
And I think that's why her work still matters now. The world feels so crazy and overwhelming. Her poetry is like a quiet place, a space to think and look inward.
It's not a passive, quiet place, though. Her poems, they make you work. They make you face tough questions, deal with complicated feelings, and see the world with new eyes.
And that's what we've been trying to do here in this deep dive, to see Emily Dickinson not just as some figure from history, but as an artist whose work is alive, it's breathing, it's still challenging us and making us think.
And we hope that by listening, you've started to see her poetry differently. That you're thinking about this connection between creativity and mental illness, and that you can appreciate how complex the human mind is and how powerful art can be.
Exactly. This isn't about finding simple answers or saying Dickinson had this or that diagnosis. It's about embracing the mystery, the things we don't know, the power her words still have.
And it's about seeing that even in the darkest parts of being human, there can be brilliance, there can be beauty, there can be insights that change how we see the world.
So, as we close out this episode of the Mad Genius Thesis, we want to leave you with this. Don't be afraid to really look at the human experience, to explore the art of people who make us question things, who push the limits of what we think is possible.
And remember, the conversation about creativity and mental illness doesn't end here. Tell us what you think, tell us your insights, share your favorite Dickinson poems, come find us on social media.
Because we need to keep talking. We need to listen to each other's stories. That's how we build a world where mental illness isn't something to be ashamed of, but a part of being human. In a world where art's power to heal and change us is recognized.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into Emily Dickinson's mind. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the life and work of some brilliant, maybe a little eccentric creator. Until then, stay curious and keep your minds open.